Night settled over Okinawa with the weight of a closing fist. On the ridge known to the men simply as the Hill, the April wind carried the metallic scent of cordite and the distant rumble of naval guns searching the darkness. Then, without warning, the bombardment returned, Japanese artillery walking its fire up the slope in deliberate steps. Each explosion carved a momentary sphere of daylight into the night, revealing the silhouettes of Americans pinned to the earth, unable to advance, unable to flee. The ridge, already soaked from days of rain and blood, seemed to tremble beneath them. Through this shifting lattice of fire, a single figure moved. He crawled low, his helmet pressed to the mud, edging toward the thin cries that rose between detonations. He carried no rifle, no sidearm, only the small canvas pouches strapped across his chest, bandages, plasma bottles wrapped in cloth, and a faith that he believed was stronger than steel. To the wounded, he appeared not as a soldier, but as a quiet presence emerging from the smoke, asking only one question: where are you hit? A mortar round cracked open the ground beside him, lifting him sideways in a shower of dirt and stone. Shrapnel burned into his leg, but he pushed himself upright, gritting against the pain. The ridge was dissolving. He could hear men shouting that the line had folded, that the Japanese were already moving to encircle them. Panic traveled faster than the shells, urging every survivor to fall back before the darkness swallowed them whole. But the medic remained. He looked down the slope where the wounded lay scattered like forgotten equipment, and he refused the order that instinct screamed at every man on that hill: run. He steadied his breath, tightened the straps of his kit, and crawled toward the nearest moan. In that darkness, after each man he pulled to safety, he whispered the same small vow, spoken not to the night but to himself: just one more. And on a ridge where survival seemed impossible, those quiet words were about to pull him deeper into a story no one watching the hill would ever forget. His name, spoken quietly among the men, was Private First Class Warren G. H. Cressy. They called him Doc, though no medical school had granted him the title. It was a name earned not through ceremony but through repetition, through the steady hands that appeared whenever a man's lifeline began to slip. In a war that often reduced individuals to ranks and numbers, his nickname carried something rarer: trust. Cressy's story began far from the Pacific, in a South defined by segregation and the long shadow of limits placed before birth. From an early age, he understood that courage alone would never guarantee recognition, and that skill could be dismissed before it was even seen. Yet he also learned that dignity could be built in quieter ways, through work, patience, and the refusal to accept the narrow roles carved out for him. Those lessons hardened into resolve long before he wore a uniform. When the world fell into conflict and recruitment posters filled town squares, Cressy volunteered. He stepped forward not out of naivete, but with the belief that service might shift the boundaries drawn around him. The Army accepted his enlistment, only to confine him within a segregated regiment, granting him tasks far from the front and even farther from the combat he hoped to face. For many, such assignments became walls. For Cressy, they became classrooms. He immersed himself in the tools of battlefield medicine, field dressings knotted in seconds, plasma rigged under rain and darkness, splints formed from whatever wood could be found. His quiet discipline did not go unnoticed. Commanders, initially reluctant to place trust in him, began to observe the simple truth: Cressy could stabilize a wounded man faster than most trained medics, and with a steadiness that never frayed under pressure. But skill, no matter how refined, could not change the nature of the war awaiting him. In 1945, as the campaign pressed toward Japan's final stronghold, Cressy was sent to a battlefield where calculation gave way to chaos, and where the difference between life and death narrowed to a single breath. What he encountered there would test more than his training, and would push the meaning of his unclaimed title to its breaking point. On Okinawa, the ridge assigned to Cressy's unit rose from the earth like the curved spine of some ancient creature. Its contours offered no shelter, no forgiving slope, only a narrow ascent under constant scrutiny from defenders who had spent months preparing the ground. Japanese forces had carved firing chambers into the limestone, transforming each cave into a hidden aperture of rifles, machine guns, and mortars. Every step upward felt as though it entered the sightline of an enemy the Americans could not yet see. The artillery duel that followed reshaped the hill itself. Shells from both armies burst across the slope in overlapping rhythms, gauge, ng deep cavities until the ground resembled a vast cratered scar. Men moved not toward an objective, but through a landscape torn apart faster than it could be understood. Dust hung in the air long after each impact, turning daylight into a muted haze that carried the faint, bitter taste of pulverized stone. Into this chaos, Cressy carried nothing that could fire a single round. By regulation, and by the medic's oath, he bore no rifle, only the worn canvas rolls containing gauze, sulfa packets, morphine syrettes, and the few tools that might coax a man back from the edge. The absence of a weapon did not make him passive. It made every movement deliberate. He knew that when the line faltered, he would be judged not by the number of enemies repelled, but by the number of wounded he could reach before their pulse faded. He had been instructed to remain behind the infantry, to treat casualties only after the advance secured ground. But Cressy understood how quickly opportunities to save a life vanished. As soon as the first wave stepped forward, he followed, crawling through shell fragments and uprooted grass to reach the cries buried beneath the noise. His refusal to remain sheltered was not defiance. It was necessity, born from the knowledge that minutes mattered more than orders. In time, the infantry learned to watch for his silhouette moving ahead of where any unarmed man should be. They would later say, with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, that on that fractured ridge there was one simple truth: if he reached you, you lived. But the ridge would soon demand more from him than courage alone, and the price of that demand was already gathering in the smoke ahead. From the outset, command envisioned the assault on the ridge as a clean, decisive stroke. Maps laid out on folding tables showed a narrow objective line, drawn in confident pencil, with arrows indicating a swift advance. The ridge appeared modest in elevation, its defenses supposedly sparse. Officers briefed their men with the assurance of a plan that had been tested, approved, and deemed sufficient. In their minds, the terrain would yield quickly, and the enemy would fall back in disarray. Yet those projections rested on intelligence that later proved dangerously incomplete. Reconnaissance had counted the Japanese defenders by the handful, unaware that entire companies were concealed within interlocking cave systems beneath the surface. Hidden galleries tunneled deep into the limestone, enabling defenders to withdraw, reappear, and strike from angles no map could capture. Still, the reports used in planning circled a number that was barely half of the true force waiting in the hill's shadows. This miscalculation shaped everything that followed. Officers told their troops that the ridge would be taken in 2 hours, an operation more akin to a firm push than a sustained fight. The men listened with a mixture of relief and optimism, believing they were stepping into one of the campaign's lighter engagements. For soldiers who had spent days fighting through mud and entrenchments, the promise of quick progress felt like a welcome reprieve. Even the seasoned infantry accepted the prediction, trusting that command had measured the task correctly. Cressy prepared his medical supplies with the same expectation. He stocked plasma units and bandages carefully, counting each item with the quiet determination of a man who believed he could treat every casualty that came his way. In his mind, readiness equaled responsibility. If the battle truly lasted only a few hours, then he could reach each wounded man before the window of survival closed. The arithmetic of mercy seemed simple enough until the shells began to fall. Among the infantry, confidence turned to humor. They joked that Okinawa, notorious for its grueling fortifications, might finally be offering them a single ridge that would behave as predicted. Laughter in wartime often masks fear, but in this case it masked belief, a belief that the hill ahead was merely another checkpoint on the long road toward victory. Few imagined the scale of what they were about to face. But the enemy had already corrected their assumptions. As the first waves approached the slope, Japanese artillery intensified, contradicting every message passed down from headquarters. Shell after shell exploded across the crest, each blast revealing the outline of defensive positions that were far more extensive than reported. The ridge was not empty. It was awake, fortified, and waiting. Still, command insisted that resistance was light, that the bombardment was a final gesture from a weakening force. Orders repeated like steady drumbeats: advance, trust the plan, maintain momentum. The soldiers marched forward with the confidence they had been given, confidence that would evaporate within minutes, replaced by the grim understanding that the ridge they approached was nothing like the ridge described on paper. And as the first platoons entered the killing zone, the truth of that misjudgment began to rise from the smoke ahead, preparing to reshape everything the medic thought he could control. The assault began with a single cautious step, then another, and with the third the ridge revealed its true nature. From the limestone face ahead came a sudden eruption of machine gun fire, precise, layered, and concentrated, yet no muzzle flash betrayed its origin. The rounds appeared as if drawn from the earth itself, entering the air at fixed angles that forced the infantry flat against the ground. For a brief moment, the Americans believed the fire was coming from a single nest. Then a second line opened, and a third. The ridge was no longer terrain, it was a living defense. What the attackers could not see from below was the system hidden within. For months, Japanese troops had carved tunnels deep into the ridge, linking natural caves with reinforced galleries. These were not isolated pockets of resistance, but chambers connected by narrow corridors that allowed defenders to shift positions without ever exposing themselves to American fire. One machine gun crew could withdraw after a burst, leaving another to take its place, creating the illusion of dozens of weapons firing in unison. The hill was a fortress turned inside out, its strength concealed beneath layers of stone. As the infantry tried to orient themselves, mortars began to fall with disturbing precision. Each round landed not in random arcs but near clusters of men who had taken cover seconds earlier. Soldiers whispered that spotters must be hidden somewhere above, tracking their movements with near-perfect clarity. Some swore they could feel eyes on their backs, as though the hill were observing them, adjusting its fire with every breath they took. Whether or not those spotters truly existed, the effect was the same. No place felt safe, and no pause lasted long enough to regain composure. Within minutes, half the forward platoon was down, some crying for help, others silent. The promise of a 2-hour operation had evaporated into a landscape of scattered bodies and shattered expectations. Command's confidence now hung in the air like smoke, thin and dissolving, replaced by the dawning recognition that they had entered a battle far more complex than their briefings had suggested. Their carefully drawn arrows and optimistic timetables could not account for a defense built underground, where maps held no meaning. Into this chaos, Cressy ran. He did not crawl or edge forward. He sprinted, his kit slapping against his side as he moved through bursts of fire that should have halted any unarmed man. He ignored the shouted warnings, the insistence that he wait for the artillery to lift. For him, the calculation was simple. Men were bleeding now, not later. Hesitation was a luxury the wounded could not afford. Each cry he heard sharpened his direction, turning the battlefield into a series of points he had to reach before the next mortar struck. He worked quickly, gauze pressed into wounds, morphine administered in measured doses, plasma hung from improvised supports. The ground shook beneath him, but his hands remained steady. By the time the first hour had passed, Cressy had treated 15 men, pulling each back from the edge long enough for stretcher teams to carry them down the slope. And still the ridge roared. The assault, far from concluding, had scarcely begun. Ahead, the hidden labyrinth continued to fire, unbroken, as though it were preparing to reveal an even deeper layer of resistance, one that would test not only the attacker's endurance, but the limits of Cressy's resolve. The momentum of the assault collapsed slowly at first, then all at once. As machine gun fire tightened its grip on the ridge, the forward elements found themselves pinned in the open, too far from safety to retreat, too exposed to advance. Wounded men lay scattered in the narrow space between both sides, a no-man's land defined not by distance, but by the unbroken arc of fire that crossed it. Some called out for help, others pressed themselves into the shallow depressions carved by earlier shells, hoping the earth might shelter them for another minute. The line had not yet broken, but it was bending under a pressure no plan had accounted for. Retreat orders were issued, but few heard them. The air was thick with the percussion of artillery, each blast swallowing the sound of human voices. Runners tried to relay commands, only to be forced back by incoming fire. Radios crackled incomprehensibly, overwhelmed by interference and the frantic movement of units trying to reorient themselves along the slope. Confusion, that unseen enemy of every battlefield, seeped through the ranks. Some units began to pull back. Others remained in place, uncertain whether falling back meant survival or a deeper exposure to the guns above. Cressy did not wait for clarity. He moved forward into the field of casualties, crawling past bodies still warm, and others already cooling in the dust. His elbows sank into the churned soil as he inched toward the nearest cry, his medical kit dragging behind him like an anchor he refused to discard. Shell fragments hissed overhead. A burst of automatic fire stitched the dirt so close that grains of earth struck his face. Still he moved, guided by instinct and the stubborn belief that reaching one man, just one, could alter the rhythm of the fight. When he found a wounded soldier, Cressy did not speak above a whisper. He slipped his arms beneath the man's shoulders, pulling him backward one desperate foot at a time. Each drag carved a narrow trail in the loose earth. Sometimes he paused to apply a tourniquet, other times he relied on speed alone, knowing the next burst could land before he finished. His work formed a quiet counterpoint to the chaos, a thread of purpose woven through the unraveling line. As the Japanese defenders adjusted their fire, their strategy shifted. Snipers, positioned in vents cut into the cave walls, began targeting medics specifically. They knew that removing the healers would erode the attackers, faster than any barrage. The Red Cross, meant as a shield under the laws of war, became a mark of vulnerability. One shot struck the ground so close to Cressy's arm that it tore the stitching on his sleeve. Without hesitation, he ripped off the armband. The gesture was not symbolic, it was survival, an attempt to erase the target painted on him by tradition and by the enemy's cold arithmetic. He tucked the band into his kit and pressed forward, a medic now indistinguishable from the infantryman he was trying to save. Despite the growing collapse around him, Cressy clung to a single belief, that if he could save enough men, if he could keep the wounded from becoming the fallen, the line might hold long enough for the assault to recover. It was a hope set against the steepest odds, yet not even the gathering storm on the ridge could pull it from him. But the battle was about to reveal an even more brutal truth, one that would force Cressy into decisions no training manual had ever prepared him to face. The mortar that struck behind Cressy did not announce itself with warning. It arrived as a single concussive blow, a rupture of air and earth that lifted him forward and dropped him hard into the dirt. For a moment, sound dissolved into a ringing void. Then sensation flooded back, heat along his thigh, the spreading burn of shrapnel embedded deep beneath the skin. He tasted dust as he pulled himself onto his elbows, realizing that the wound was serious enough to stop most men in their tracks. But the battlefield allowed no pause. The next cry for help rose through the smoke, and Cressy forced himself toward it. He reached for his own bandage roll, fingers shaking slightly, and wrapped the cloth tightly around his leg. The knot he tied was practiced, efficient, no different from the hundreds he had fastened on others, save for the pain that followed each pull. Once the bleeding slowed, he pushed off the ground and resumed crawling. His movements were slower now, uneven, but deliberate. The wound had not altered his purpose. It had merely sharpened his awareness of time. Every second he spent tending to himself was a second the wounded nearby did not have. As he reached the next cluster of casualties, he realized his medical kit was nearly empty. The earlier hours had consumed supplies at a pace he had never experienced. Plasma bottles lay spent in the mud. Gauze rolls were reduced to cardboard cores. Even morphine syrettes, so often rationed carefully, were gone. Necessity forced him into a kind of battlefield ingenuity, the kind born not from training but from the urgency of human need. He cut strips from torn uniforms and fashioned them into tourniquets. He used rifle slings to stabilize limbs. Anything with enough strength to bind or support became part of his improvised arsenal. The wounded continued to accumulate faster than he could reach them. Some were beyond help, others hovered in the fragile space between life and loss. Cressy adapted again. After stabilizing one man, he lifted another, hoisting him across his shoulders. Soon he began carrying two at once, one over each arm, staggering downhill with the burden balanced across him like uneven weights. The slope offered no mercy. Loose soil slid beneath his boots, sending him sideways as he fought to maintain his footing. Yet he returned each time to the ridge, climbing upward through the gunfire, driven by the simple arithmetic of survival. 2 saved was better than 1. His fellow infantry watched this routine with disbelief. Between bursts of fire, they shouted for him to stop, to sit down, to let someone else take over. They told him his wound was worsening, that he was courting death with every attempt to climb back into the open. Some grabbed his arm, trying to pull him behind the lines for rest, but he slipped from their grasp, refusing to be sighed. Lined, rest, to Cressy, meant abandoning someone who might otherwise live, and on that ridge abandonment felt indistinguishable from failure. As the hours stretched, the men around him began to understand that his struggle was more than physical. Cressy fought not only against the enemy, but against the silence that often swallowed the contributions of men like him, men assigned to segregated units, men whose heroism might never make it into official reports. Every soldier he saved stood as quiet proof that courage did not require recognition to exist. Yet those who watched him feared something deeper, that this medic, driven by a mission larger than his own body, might lose himself entirely in the effort. In the fading light, they saw him limping uphill again, bandaged leg dragging, shoulders squared against the fire. And in that moment they understood the truth that would follow him long after the ridge fell. Cressy was risking more than life. He was risking the one thing war often denies its bravest participants, the chance to be remembered. But the ridge was not finished with him yet, and the next test would push him beyond endurance, into a night where even the strongest resolve could begin to fracture. As night settled unevenly across the ridge, the battle shifted into a quieter, more brutal rhythm. The initial waves of chaos gave way to a slower violence, one measured not by advances or retreats, but by the growing number of men who could no longer rise. Among them were the medics, those who had stepped into the open again and again, trusting that the small red cross on their sleeves might grant them a measure of protection. But on this ridge, against an enemy firing from hidden angles, symbols held no power. By midnight, several had been shot outright. Others lay wounded beyond help, calling weakly for assistance they had once given so freely. The chain of survival was breaking link by link. Cressy soon realized he was the only functioning medic left across an entire stretch of the line, a segment nearly half a company wide. The responsibility settled onto him like a second wound, heavy and undeniable. No one ordered him to take on the burden, no command post directed him to fill the gap. The battlefield itself dictated the role. The cries had not stopped, and until they did, he understood that he alone remained to answer them. The thought did not embolden him. It simply narrowed his world to the closest voice calling his name. With supplies dwindling, he turned to rationing morphine with a precision that bordered on mathematical. Each syringe became a calculation. Was the man before him in pain or beyond endurance? Would morphine bring relief or hasten unconsciousness in a soldier who needed to remain awake for evacuation? Cressy made those decisions in seconds, guided by instinct and the subdued clarity that exhaustion sometimes grants. He kept the final few doses for wounds that screamed louder than the artillery, injuries where shock alone was a mercy too fragile to trust. The ground between the lines, 50 yards of exposed slope, became his nightly route. He crawled forward to treat the wounded, then backward to drag them to relative safety, repeating the cycle with the persistence of a man who no longer counted his own strength. The kill zone had been blasted into a patchwork of craters and broken roots, its surface shifting under each explosion. He knew its contours not by sight but by touch, the ridge of dirt that hid a fallen corporal, the hollow where a sergeant clung to consciousness. These landmarks formed the map he navigated after the sun fell and smoke smothered the moonlight. Each artillery burst shook mud loose from the trees, coating the ground in a damp film that clung to his hands and blurred his vision. The air thickened until breathing felt like dragging smoke into his lungs. At times, the haze grew so dense that Cressy could see no more than a foot ahead. He learned to keep one hand on the earth, feeling for the familiar shapes he had memorized: stones, splintered branches, the torn fabric of uniforms marking where men still waited. The journey outward was always dangerous, but the return was worse. Carrying a wounded man made him slower, heavier, and louder. Each movement risked drawing fire from snipers who listened more than they looked, tracking the subtle shifts of weight on the soil. Cressy felt the bullets pass near him, heard the crack of rifles aimed at the sound of retreat. More than once he dropped flat, shielding the man on his shoulders with his own body until the shooting paused. Yet he made the trip again and again, not quickly, not gracefully, but relentlessly. Through the hours when even the strongest soldiers began to believe the night had no end, Cressy gave the line something it had nearly lost: rhythm. With each man he treated, another heartbeat returned to the unit. With each evacuation, the line, shattered, shrinking, but still breathing, held a little longer against the ridge that was trying to erase it. By dawn, he had crossed that kill zone so many times that the paths of his crawls stitched the earth like seams. But the sun would bring no relief, only a clearer view of how close the line had come to breaking, and how much further he would have to go before the night's work was finished. For most soldiers, battle is measured in minutes, bursts of terror separated by uneasy lulls. But on the ridge at Okinawa, time unraveled. Hours no longer followed one another. They folded into a single, unbroken stretch of screams, drifting smoke, and the metallic smell of blood settling into the soil. Darkness pressed against the world like a closing hand, and every explosion carved momentary windows into a landscape that no longer resembled terrain. In that shifting world, Cressy continued to move, each step a negotiation with exhaustion that threatened to claim him long before the enemy did. As the night grew thick, he felt the limits of his body begin to fray. His vision blurred into soft shapes. His hands, once steady and practiced, trembled so violently that he had to pause between movements, willing them into obedience. The ground beneath him oscillated with the cadence of artillery, and more than once he lost balance, catching himself with fingers numb from cold and shock. Yet each time he steadied his breath, forced the world back into focus, and crawled toward the next wounded man calling through the smoke. With lanterns shattered and flashlights long since spent, Cressy stitched wounds in near-total darkness. He relied on touch, on the heat of torn flesh beneath his fingers, the subtle change in texture where bone had shattered, the familiar feel of dressings as he packed them into wounds he could not fully see. He whispered to the men as he worked, not for reassurance but to anchor himself, to keep from drifting into the daze that waited at the edges of his awareness. At one point, struggling with a bandage slick with mud and blood, he lacked the strength in his hands to pull the knot tight. Without hesitation, he leaned forward and gripped the fabric between his teeth, jerking his head back to cinch it. The soldier beneath him exhaled with relief, a sound so fragile amid the thunder of battle that it seemed borrowed from another world. Moments like this blurred together, forming a tapestry of small victories stitched against overwhelming odds. He stopped counting rescues after 50. Numbers lost meaning in the haze. What mattered was the rhythm: reach, treat, drag, return. Yet by the time dawn hinted at the edges of the sky, the number of men he had saved would climb past 200. None of them witnessed his tally, none saw the quiet arithmetic of his service. They only felt the sudden presence of a medic who arrived when all hope seemed spent, working with the precision of someone who believed every life must be pulled from the balance one by one. His own shrapnel wound, temporarily sealed by the bandage hours earlier, reopened again and again. Each climb up the ridge tore at the fragile clot, sending fresh streams of blood down his leg until the fabric of his trousers clung to him like a second skin. At times he paused, not to rest, but to gather the strength to lift himself back into motion. Pain sharpened into a constant companion, but he treated it as he treated everything else that night, something to be endured, not considered. Through it all, one phrase guided him. He spoke it softly, sometimes to the wounded as he lifted them, sometimes to himself as he forced his body back uphill. Just one more. It was not a declaration of heroism, nor a challenge to fate. It was a promise, a narrow path through the chaos, allowing him to move forward without confronting the immensity of the task. One more life, one more reach through the smoke, one more return down the shattered slope. Across 30 hours without horizon, Cressy existed between exhaustion and will, between the ridge that tried to break him and the men who clung to life because he answered their cries. And as the faint light of morning grew stronger, revealing the full measure of the battlefield, the question waiting in that new day was simple and unforgiving. How much longer could one man continue to carry the weight that a whole medical unit once held? Dawn rose reluctantly over Okinawa, filtering through a sky stained by smoke and drifting ash. Its first light fell upon a scene that should not have existed, fragments of a line still holding, scattered across a ridge that had tried all night to erase them. When the reinforcements arrived, men who had marched toward the sound of relentless artillery, they expected to find only silence and the bodies of those who had stood before them. Instead, they saw movement. Exhausted soldiers still gripping their rifles, wounded men propped against rubble, and a medic limping from crater to crater as though the night had never ended. The officers accompanying the new arrivals said in disbelief. Reports during the night had suggested collapse was inevitable, that the ridge was moments from being overrun. Yet here it stood, battered but unbroken. When they asked how such a fragile line had endured, the soldiers did not give long explanations. They merely pointed toward the medic moving through the smoke, his bandaged leg stiff, his uniform soaked through with the blood of others and his own. In their weary eyes, the answer was self-evident. The line had survived because one man had refused to let it die. Word spread along the ridge with a quiet urgency. The medic Cressy was still standing, still working, still pulling men from the edge hours after even the most seasoned among them believed the night was lost. Something in that realization steadied the men who remained. Fatigue had hollowed them, but the sight of Cressy's persistence became a kind of rallying point, proof that endurance was still possible. Slowly, almost cautiously, soldiers who had braced for death began preparing to move forward again. Not because they felt stronger, but because they could no longer justify retreat in the presence of someone who had never once taken a step backward. Orders for a counterattack spread through the fragmented companies, gathering shape from the scattered will of those still alive. Smoke grenades were pulled from pouches and struck against helmets, releasing thick gray plumes that drifted outward like slow-moving tides. The grenades masked their approach, blurring the view of the defenders above and offering a brief chance to regain momentum. The Americans advanced through earth torn open by artillery, their boots sinking into the soft churn of mud and shattered stone. Every movement felt heavier than it should have, yet each step carried the faint surge of possibility. The Japanese defenders sensed the shift. All night they had fired steadily, confident in their advantage from the concealed tunnels and interlocking chambers beneath the ridge. But daylight exposed their limitations. Ammunition that had seemed plentiful in darkness now dwindled. Machine guns stuttered from lack of belts. Mortar crews searched for shells that were no longer there. The defenders still held the high ground, but the certainty that had guided them began to erode with each passing minute. Even the strongest fortification falters when its rhythm breaks. A flanking squad, guided by the faint outlines of cave entrances revealed by the rising sun, moved toward one of the ridge's hidden openings. They approached quietly, slipping through the smoke with a discipline shaped by desperation. When they reached the entrance, they hurled charges inside, their detonations collapsing part of the interior tunnel. Dust billowed outward, and for the first time the Americans saw chaos ripple through the defenders' lines. Shouts echoed beneath the ground as the interconnected network, the true strength of the ridge, began to fracture. The collapse of the tunnel did more than destroy a single position. It disrupted the system that had allowed the Japanese to move unseen, to appear and vanish with unnerving precision. The fortress beneath the earth had been breached, and with that breach came the first genuine tilt in the battle. The Americans felt it, a shift subtle yet decisive, like the moment a wave begins to recede. For the first time since the assault began, the ridge leaned in their favor. Men who had spent the night clinging to life now pushed forward, driven not by confidence but by the recognition that the impossible no longer felt unattainable. And behind them, moving with the same quiet persistence that had carried him through the night, Cressy followed, still bandaged, still bleeding, still answering every cry he heard. But the ridge had one more turn left in it, and the cost of claiming it would soon rise again, testing whether the momentum gained at dawn could survive the next storm gathering beneath the smoke. With the first light of day widening across the ridge, momentum, so elusive through the long night, finally began to lean toward the Americans. Engineers were called forward, their movement steady despite the uneven ground beneath them. They carried flamethrowers strapped to their backs, heavy cylinders of fuel and pressure that turned each man into a walking furnace. These weapons were not subtle. They were instruments built for the brutal work of clearing entrenched defenders who would not yield. As they advanced, the engineers studied the contours of the slope, searching for the dark fissures that marked the cave mouths feeding the ridge's defense. When the first jet of flame erupted, it stretched across the bunker's opening like a burning curtain. The fire crawled inside, clinging to stone and timber, consuming the air in violent surges. Japanese defenders, long sheltered in the cool interiors of their chambers, were forced into the open or deeper underground where the flames chased the oxygen from the room. Knee by one, the strongpoints that had anchored the night's relentless barrage began to fall. Smoke rose in long, twisting columns, merging with the lingering haze of artillery until the ridge appeared to burn from within. Even as this final push unfolded, Cressy did not step back. He moved among the advancing troops, tending to those hit by sudden bursts of fire or fragments from collapsing structures. His limp was pronounced now, a slow drag of his wounded leg through soil that had been churned into a dense, uneven paste. Officers urged him to withdraw, reminding him that the medics arriving with the reinforcements could take over. But Cressy refused evacuation. He had begun this fight at the ridge's foot. He would see it through at its crest. The wounded who fell during the push did not have time for protocol. They had time only for whomever reached them first. The ground shook without pause as explosives detonated along the ridge, collapsing tunnels and breaking apart wooden supports. The shockwaves did not discriminate. They rolled through friend and foe alike, shaking the resolve of men who had already given more than their bodies could afford. Shell shock spread through both sides, an invisible tremor that left hands unsteady and breath shallow. For brief moments, the battlefield seemed suspended in a kind of shared bewilderment, as though both armies sensed the ridge itself might give way before they did. Still the soldiers pushed forward. Their rifles slipped in hands blistered from heat and friction, but they held them tight, climbing over mounds of shattered rock and debris. Some had to drag themselves the final yards, strength bleeding away with every movement. Yet the collective will to finish what had begun in the dark drove them onward. They advanced not with the confidence of victory, but with the quiet insistence born from exhaustion, the need to end the fight before the fight ended them. The turning point of the final assault arrived without fanfare. Deep within the ridge's tunnel network, a series of internal detonations, set off by trapped munitions or desperate measures, rippled outward. A key cave system, one of the central arteries of Japanese movement through the hill, collapsed in on itself. Dust surged from its entrance, billowing outward like breath released from a dying body. The defenders' ability to reposition evaporated. Their fire slackened, then faltered, then ceased in pockets across the slope. What had been an impenetrable fortress hours earlier now sagged under the weight of its own destruction. The Americans pressed upward through the fading resistance, firing in short, controlled bursts until the last holdouts fell silent. By late afternoon, the ridge, this narrow, jagged strip of earth that had cost so many hours of terror and endurance, stood in American hands. Soldiers who could barely stand leaned against shattered trees or knelt in the dirt, absorbing the reality that the battle that began under darkness had ended under a sun they had not expected to see. For Cressy, the moment passed without ceremony. He moved from one wounded man to the next, carrying the same tools, the same determination, unchanged by victory. He had been the line when the line nearly collapsed. He had carried the wounded when the ridge offered no shelter. And now, as the guns cooled and the smoke thinned, he continued his quiet labor. But the ridge's fall did not bring closure. It only revealed the deeper question waiting at its summit. What would become of a medic who had given everything, in a war that rarely remembered the men who saved rather than took lives? When the last shots faded across the ridge, the silence that followed felt unfamiliar, too wide, too fragile, as if the battlefield itself were uncertain how to exist without the sound of guns. It was in that sudden stillness that Cressy's body, pushed beyond every natural threshold, finally surrendered. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the shredded earth he had crossed so many times. Men nearby rushed to him, calling his name, but his eyes were half closed, his breath shallow. The ridge had been taken, but its final toll was only now coming due. Medics from the reinforcement units hurried to his side. They lifted him gently, astonished by the dead weight of a man who had carried others for so long, and placed him on a stretcher. Blood soaked through the bandage around his thigh, the wound reopened from strain and exhaustion. As they carried him down the slope, they passed the routes he had crawled through the night, trails etched into the earth like the marks of someone carving survival into the ground itself. When they reached the field station, doctors gathered with a sense of urgency normally reserved for the gravest cases. What they found stunned them. Cressy's uniform had hardened into a crust of dried blood, the fabric stiffened by layer upon layer of hours-long exposure. Some of the blood belonged to the men he had treated, but much of it was his own, leaked from a wound that should have immobilized him, perhaps even ended him. The doctors exchanged glances, quiet, professional, but underscored by disbelief. They checked his vitals, noted his blood pressure falling, and murmured the same observation in different tones. He should not have been walking. He should not have lasted this long. Outside the field station, word spread quickly. Soldiers who had fought beside him, who had watched him crawl through gunfire, drag bodies through craters, and return again and again when no one else could, gathered in a long, uneven line. Some were bandaged, some leaned on makeshift crutches. Others sat in the dirt, too weak to stand but unwilling to leave. They waited not for orders or recognition, but for an answer to the only question that mattered. Would he live? No one told them to disperse. No one considered it. They simply waited with the stillness of men who understood the scale of what had been risked for them. Inside, doctors worked quickly. They cleaned the wound, replaced the soaked bandages, and administered plasma to stabilize what remained of his strength. One physician paused during the procedure, studying the pattern of abrasions along Cressy's arms and hands, marks from dragging bodies, from crawling across stone and shrapnel. The doctor shook his head, not in judgment but in quiet awe. "This man should have died many hours ago," he said softly. And yet Cressy remained, suspended somewhere between consciousness and exhaustion, held aloft by the same will that had carried him through the night. At last, after what felt like a long and fragile stretch of minutes, Cressy stirred. His eyelids fluttered, then opened just enough to register the dim outline of the tent above him. His voice was barely audible, thin, cracked, worn down to its simplest form. He asked only one question: "Did they make it?" It was the question of a man who had never fought for glory or recognition, only for the lives placed in front of him. The soldiers standing vigil outside leaned in as the reply moved through the tent flap and into the line like a current of relief. His men answered with the truth, the only truth that mattered. "Because of you." The words settled over the wounded, over the doctors, over the ridge itself, as if they belonged to the air now reclaimed from the night's violence. Cressy managed a faint nod, the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. His eyes closed again, not in defeat but in long-delayed rest. Yet even as the soldiers breathed easier, another question lingered just beyond the edges of the tent. What would become of this medic whose courage had stitched the line back together, in an army that often remembered victories more readily than the men who made them possible? The next hours would reveal an answer as uncertain as the dawn that followed the ridge. In the days that followed the fighting on the ridge, officers gathered what remained of their units and began the slow, methodical process of documenting actions taken under fire. Such reports were more than paperwork. They formed the official memory of a battle. And in those brief windows of administrative clarity, when the guns fell silent long enough for pens to steady, several officers drafted recommendations for the Medal of Honor. They cited Cressy's endurance, his repeated crossings of the kill zone, his refusal to withdraw even when wounded, and the staggering number of lives he saved. On the ridge, there was no debate. The men who watched him work believed he had earned the nation's highest recognition. But the world beyond the ridge followed different rhythms. In 1945, the machinery of military bureaucracy carried an unspoken truth. Recommendations for black soldiers traveled slowly, and too often, they simply died quietly along the way. The Army remained a segregated institution, its structure built on divisions that determined not only assignments and housing, but the visibility of heroism itself. A report could be written with precision, endorsed with signatures, and yet still drift into a silence from which it never returned. Valor was not always what determined a medal's path. Sometimes its journey depended on who had performed the act and whose desks the papers landed upon. Testimonies were filed by officers and enlisted men alike. They described the ridge as untenable, the night as hopeless, and the medic as the singular reason the line did not collapse. Some accounts were detailed, recounting specific rescues under fire. Others were brief but unwavering in their praise. Yet as these testimonies moved between commands, many simply vanished. Folders misplaced, reports overlooked. Documentation rerouted through offices already burdened with the administrative chaos of a global war nearing its end. Not all losses in wartime occur on battlefields. Some happen in filing cabinets. A few officers, speaking quietly among themselves, admitted what they feared Washington would conclude. They believed the recommendation would stall, perhaps indefinitely, not because it lacked merit, but because the nation was not yet prepared to bestow its highest military honor upon a black medic, no matter how extraordinary his actions had been. They knew the traditions of recognition, the unwritten boundaries that shaped who was celebrated and who was forgotten. Their frustration did not change the system, it only underscored its frailty. By the time Cressy returned home, the war's administrative machinery had already moved on. The Pacific Campaign neared its end, Europe had surrendered, and the country looked toward reconstruction rather than re-examining the quiet heroism of its segregated units. Cressy received the standard commendations issued to men of his rank, awards that acknowledged participation, not distinction. Nowhere in the official record did a line appear to suggest he had carried a company's hope on his back through 30 hours of unbroken combat. The absence was not an oversight. It was the predictable consequence of a system that often valued the appearance of equality more than the practice of it. Segregation buried the scale of his valor beneath administrative silence. What he had done on the ridge was known intimately, verified by witnesses, affirmed by officers, and lived by the men whose names he kept alive through the night. But institutionally, his bravery was diluted by the time it reached the channels meant to amplify it. Reports became summaries, summaries became footnotes, and footnotes became omissions. In the end, the ridge stood more prominently in memory than the medic who had kept it from falling. Yet the men he saved did not forget. They wrote letters, they told their families, they spoke his name in reunions and in the quiet, reflective moments when war stories surface without warning. They remembered the silhouette moving through fire, the voice that whispered just one more, the presence that arrived when survival felt out of reach. To them, no medal could have equaled the truth they carried. Still, the question lingered like an unfinished sentence. If the institution remained silent, who would speak for Cressy in the years after the war, when memory itself began to blur around the edges? The answer would emerge slowly, shaped not by policy but by persistence, waiting in the decades beyond the ridge. When the last battles of the Second World War quieted, and the world turned its attention toward rebuilding, America entered a new chapter, one defined by factories reawakening, families reunited, and the nation attempting to fathom the scale of what had been endured. In that climate, few possessed the patience or appetite to revisit the unresolved injustices left behind on distant ridges and forgotten islands. The war had produced millions of stories, each inscribed with sacrifice. Yet only a fraction would ever be revisited, and far fewer would be corrected. Into that vast, shifting landscape, Cressy's heroic night on Okinawa slipped almost unnoticed. He returned home quietly, shrinking from the attention he had never sought. His body carried wounds that resisted healing, shrapnel too deep to remove, nerves too damaged to fully recover. Some days he moved with the same limp that had accompanied him up and down the ridge. On others, the pain forced him to remain still. Yet he rarely spoke of the battle, not out of secrecy, but because reliving it offered nothing but memories of men he could save and those he could not. His life resumed in modest rhythms, marked less by recognition than by the quiet endurance that had defined him long before the war. The veterans who had survived because of him did not forget. They wrote letters on his behalf to commanders, to regional offices, to national boards, detailing once more what Cressy had accomplished in 30 hours without stopping. They described the ridge as a place where time broke, where one medic became the difference between holding the line and losing it entirely. But the responses they received were sparse, polite, and ultimately empty. Some letters were acknowledged briefly, others were never answered. The machinery of recognition, long rigid in its habits, seemed incapable of reaching backward to correct its own omissions. Historians who studied Okinawa in the years that followed encountered only traces of Cressy's story. Official reports made brief clinical mentions of a medic who crossed the kill zone repeatedly, but these accounts lacked the weight of testimony preserved by those who had witnessed it firsthand. In academic texts, his name was often absent, replaced by references to a medic or an aide man. The erasure was not deliberate, it was structural. Where documentation had failed to preserve him, later histories had little upon which to build. And so his deeds became faint, almost spectral, surviving only as fragments within broader unit narratives. As decades passed, even those fragments began to thin. Veterans aged. Reunions grew smaller. The ridge that had once burned with life and death faded into memory, replaced by the distance of time and the reality that every generation buries the stories it cannot carry forward in full. Yet even as the institutional memory dimmed, the men who had been with Cressy that night maintained a different account, one grounded not in paperwork but in lived experience. They spoke of him with the same quiet reverence reserved for turning points that never make the official record. They insisted that his actions did not simply aid the line. They held it together when failure seemed inevitable. They recalled how the night pressed in like a tide, how the ridge threatened to swallow them, and how Cressy moved through that darkness with nothing but bandages and the unwavering decision to return each time someone called out. His 30 hours became, in their retelling, something beyond bravery, an inflection point between life and oblivion. To them, his endurance was not a footnote. It was the hinge upon which an entire company's survival turned. And whenever they gathered to remember the ridge, their voices aligned on one truth. Those hours were, as one survivor put it, the difference between life and darkness. Yet even as those words echoed, they hinted at the question still waiting beyond the horizon, whether a nation ready to honor victory would ever choose to confront the stories it had allowed to fade. In recent years, as archives opened and long-buried reports resurfaced, modern researchers pieced together the fragments of a story that had nearly slipped beyond recovery. Among the rediscovered documents were field testimonies, casualty logs, and after-action notes that converged on a single truth. Cressy had rescued more than 200 men in a span of 30 hours. The number was not an estimate or a legend grown with retelling. It was a tally confirmed across multiple accounts, a figure that placed his endurance in a category few soldiers in any war had ever reached. Military analysts, studying the reconstructed record with the calm distance of time, have since called his feat one of the most sustained acts of battlefield courage ever documented. They note not only the physical toll of the rescues, but the conditions under which they occurred. Crossing a kill zone repeatedly, working alone after every other medic fell, and pressing forward while his own blood pooled inside his uniform. Courage in war is often measured in moments. A charge, a defense, a split-second decision. Cressy's was measured in hours, and then in more hours beyond those, an unbroken chain of choices made under fire. Historians, revisiting the administrative trail that followed his actions, reached a conclusion the men on the ridge had long understood. Racism, not merit, kept his Medal of Honor recommendation from reaching Washington intact. The missing reports, the stalled paperwork, the quiet disappearance of testimonies between commands, they were not unfortunate coincidences, but reflections of an institution still defined by barriers that shaped who could be celebrated and who remained unseen. By acknowledging this, historians did more than correct a record. They illuminated the structures that once silenced stories like Cressy's. Yet while the institution forgot him, the men whose lives he carried off that ridge did not. Veterans, families still speak his name at remembrance ceremonies, repeating it alongside their fathers and grandfathers, aware that their existence is woven directly into his endurance. Some bring photographs. Others bring folded letters, written decades earlier by men who struggled to put into words what survival had meant to them. In these gatherings, Cressy is remembered not as a symbol but as a presence, a quiet figure moving through fire, arriving when hope had nearly run out. His story endures as a reminder of how easily heroism can be obscured when institutions falter. Recognition in war is never guaranteed. It depends on systems that are often overwhelmed, imperfect, or shaped by prejudice. Cressy's absence from the highest honors is not an isolated oversight, but part of a larger pattern, one in which extraordinary acts by marginalized soldiers remain in the margins of official memory. His legacy forces a reckoning with what is preserved, what is lost, and what stories must be fought for long after the guns fall silent. The ridge itself remains unchanged in the decades since the war, quiet, overgrown, and unmarked by the violence it once held. But for those who know what happened there, it stands as silent testimony to the cost of being unseen. The stones along its slope once carried the weight of men who believed they would die. They also carried the weight of a medic who refused to let them. The earth remembers even when institutions do not. In the end, they denied him the medal, but they could not deny the lives he saved, the line he held together, or the truth that emerged despite every attempt to bury it. His legacy survives not because the army preserved it, but because the men who lived through the darkness insisted that the world should know the name of the one who walked into it, again and again, whispering the same quiet vow, just one more. And in that vow, his story finds the closure the record never gave him, an echo carried forward by those who lived because he refused to stop.